You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome to another installment of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Dara Albrecht, and I'm here with three wonderful guests, Viveca Morris, Dan Piselli, and Christine Sheppard. And we're here to talk about bird-safe buildings. Viveca Morris is the executive director of the Law, Environment, and Animals program at Yale Law School and is a research scholar. She also runs the Yale Bird-Friendly Building Initiative. Dan Piselli is the director of sustainability at FXCollaborative Architects and is also the co-chair of a policy subcommittee at the American Institute of Architects Committee on the Environment in New York City. And finally, Christine Sheppard is a scientist and the senior director of the Glass Collisions program for the American Bird Conservancy. We've all seen or heard of a bird colliding with a glass pane or window of a building. Although seeing a collision happen might seem like a one-off event, this has actually become quite a widespread issue in the U.S. and across the world. Viveca, could you give us a quick overview of the problem? What's actually happening here?
Around 1 billion birds are killed every year by collisions with buildings in the US alone, and recent studies estimate that even that staggering number of 1 billion may be quite a dramatic undercount. So by some estimates, that's as much as 2 to 10% of the country's entire bird population that's impacted by collisions in a given year. And this is occurring amidst a broad crisis for birds in the country and beyond. And building collisions, we know, are one of the leading direct threats causing massive bird decline. And so the root cause of the problem, as Dan and Chris know well, is quite simple, which is that most birds can't see most glass. And over the past century plus, as large glass sheets and windows have proliferated across the country and across the world, birds have become unintended victims in truly staggering numbers.
I've mentioned how plenty of people have watched a bird collide with a building. In my experience, I've watched them collide with a window and then act stunned, but then eventually fly away. But in general, when birds are colliding, are they dying most of the time? And what happens if they don't die? Is there a possibility of recovery? Could they be at risk for other health issues? If they're migrating and they collide with a building, is it possible that they can't complete their migration and then be at risk because of that? What are the range of outcomes that birds can face after collision?
Well, you just did a good summary. Many of the birds that hit buildings are killed immediately, but they can sometimes splutter away. But think about a bird with a concussion. Many of these birds have internal injuries and they die within a few days. Many are simply much more vulnerable to predation or to weather incidents and so forth. So they very well may not be able to complete that migration. And that is really having an impact on bird populations.
It really is heartbreaking when you hear about all of the negative outcomes birds can face. And hearing the shocking numbers Viveca put forth is a really good way to contextualize just how widespread this issue is. It seems that the more development and construction we do across the country, the problem only seems to worsen. When you think about development, skyscrapers and big cities and big glass panes on tall buildings come to mind. But Chris, is this bird building collision issue only a problem in cities, or is this also appearing in large-scale construction sites or other places outside of urban areas?
It's actually worse than that. Collisions happen wherever there's glass and birds in the same place. Birds are found across the landscape. Almost 50% of collisions take place on private homes. So this is not really an urban issue. There's a sort of a myth that associates collisions with skyscrapers, but only 1 or 2% of collisions take place on skyscrapers. Collisions take place sort of in the bird activity zone, just the way most car crashes happen within 20 miles of home, because that's where you do all your driving. Birds spend their time in trees, looking for vegetation. That's where they get food. That's where they get shelter. That's where they have perches. And it's the reflections of that greenery that are associated with the most collisions.
I also wanted to quickly ask about bird migration flyways. A migration flyway is a defined route or pathways that migratory species follow, And when you mark them on a map, you can see approximate pathways that the birds take. Are these defined flyways the places where we need to be preventing the issue? I also wanted to ask where bird migration flyways factor into this equation. A migration flyway is a defined route or pathway that migratory species follow year to year. And when you look at them on a map, you can see approximate pathways that the migratory species take. So, the defined flyways that we have, are those the places we need to focus to prevent this issue?
People really talk about flyways, but flyway is a concept that was derived to talk about waterfowl migration. Waterfowl tend to follow rivers because they need common resources that are available in water. This is not true for songbirds, which are the most frequent collision victims. In fact, it's better for them to spread out when they are flying. This means that there are birds flying everywhere. It's impossible to pick out one space and say, okay, there won't be any collisions there. Light does suck them into cities, but they're just as likely to land in areas outside cities that face collision risks there. This means that birds are almost everywhere in the environment.
That's definitely something to consider. With a lot of bird species across the country, we're seeing issues related to biodiversity loss. I'm wondering how the bird buildings collision issue is related to that overall trend.
I like to think about this bird collision issue in the broader context of human impact on the environment, especially the climate crisis, but also pollution. And as an architect, I have a few levers that I can use to help birds. The first is just reducing the energy use of buildings, which reduces climate emissions and all the related impacts on habitat. Also, land use. How do we design sites to improve or reconnect habitat? Material selection is important to minimize pollution from extraction and manufacturing. We can choose wood from sustainably managed forests instead of unintentionally supporting plantations or destructive clear-cutting. We can help reduce light pollution that disrupts migration. And finally, the issue of collisions with glass just happens to be the most direct, in-your-face example, and that's part of the reason that it's interesting to me.
Thank you, Dan. That really adds a new layer to the conversation. And Viveca touched on this a little bit, but Chris, I'd be really interested to hear from you as a scientist. What is the biology behind this issue? Why are birds uniquely vulnerable to collisions and other construction-related hazards?
People are often really surprised to discover that they can't see glass either. We learn about glass when we're small. We bump into it, but people are actually injured running into glass walls and doors every year. We understand glass as a concept, as a transparent barrier that can be reflective as well as transparent. Birds don't understand that glass can be a transparent barrier. If they see plants on the other side, whether it's potted plants or habitat, they think they can fly through that glass to reach that greenery. So they take the world literally. If there's a glass wall that reflects vegetation in the sky, they think it's more habitat. If there's a glass wall and behind it are lots of plants, they think they can fly to those plants.
As you brought up earlier, songbirds are at greater risk than waterfowl, and those are pretty broad categories. Is there any particular species that is at greater risk or the greatest risk of a collision?
There are species that seem to collide more than others. Luckily for us, we don't really need to know that. We understand how to stop collisions. And if we can stop collisions for small birds, we can stop collisions for basically any bird.
Got it. I hadn't considered that before. So when we're thinking about solutions, we only really need to get to a certain grain to be able to cover every kind of bird, and we don't have to worry so much about species level protections.
Exactly.
To follow up on something you said earlier, I liked the analogy you used of the 20-mile radius around your home being the place where you're most likely to get in a car accident, and that it's similar for birds, that there are perches and vegetation around the places where they collide. But is there also something about their physiology, maybe their eyesight or lack of speed and control in flight, or something else that might contribute to the frequency of bird collisions? Are there other animals that experience similar glass collisions?
Well, there are people, if you go on the internet, you'll see pictures of dogs and other critters running into glass because it is literally invisible. And if you don't know, or don't expect it to be there, you can run into it. Birds, because they fly so quickly, are particularly vulnerable. Somehow, there are some birds like swallows that don't collide very often. And my guess is that as they get close to glass, they perceive wind currents. They know that there's something happening up there and they can turn on a dime. Not all birds could do that. So if a bird perceives that there's a barrier there, it may be going so fast that it can't change direction and avoid the collision.
Given the problem that you've all outlined, how can we move towards a resolution?
Some of the solutions to the bird collision problem can be very simple or complex, depending on what kind of project you have and what you want to do. Some buildings are bird safe without even trying to be, because they have aesthetic perforated panels covering the windows. I can think of a building at the Cooper Union here in New York City that's like that. Other buildings use solar shading devices to reduce energy loads. And if spaced closely enough, those solar shading devices can be bird friendly. An example building would be the New York Times building here in New York City. And then for the glass itself, there are various ways to put patterns on the glass that make it visible to birds. And those patterns can be dots, lines, other shapes. What matters is the space between them and the size of them, so that they're big enough for birds to see and the spaces are small enough that they don't think they can fly through them. And some solutions are very transparent. The more expensive ones use ultraviolet reflective materials that birds can see, but humans either can't see or can see less, let's say. So we've used some of those in some buildings. And from the inside, you can barely tell that there's anything there at all. And it doesn't distract a person from their view looking out. So there's a range from very impactful on purpose to super subtle.
It's really interesting that there are so many options available to builders to make buildings bird friendly, but also to allow them to still have creative and aesthetic control over the building. Dan, you're an architect by training, and I'm curious, in your former architecture training, did you learn about bird-safe building strategies? Or is it something that's often overlooked in architectural education?
Well, I went to college back in the 90s when they weren't even really teaching sustainable design at all in most schools. And no, the bird collision issue was not on anybody's radar, so to speak, back then. I actually learned this from Chris. The first bird-friendly building I worked on was at the Center for Global Conservation at the Bronx Zoo. And Chris was going to have an office there and helped us understand what the issues were and test out various solutions, some of which worked and some of which didn't. But that building helped contribute to the body of science around the issue.
Viveca, what role could state or local governments play in protecting wildlife and protecting birds in particular? Can they set more stringent standards to avoid bird collisions or to encourage bird-safe building practices? And what other mechanisms could they use to combat this problem?
Yeah. So, in the absence of any federal action on this issue, many cities and local governments have emerged as leaders on this topic to try to protect birds over the past 2 decades or so. And I think what it comes down to is we know, as Chris and Dan have said, what's causing the problem of bird window collisions. We know a lot of ways to solve it, but that only matters to the birds if these solutions are implemented at wide scale, which is why we really need public policy on this issue. And just fixing an iconic building here or a residence there, while worthwhile, is not going to do it adequately. So bird-friendly building policy started in the U.S. in 2008 in the Forest Preserve District of Cook County, Illinois. And since then, more than 20 different U.S. cities and localities have enacted bird-friendly building policies of different types. Typically, these policies work by modifying building or zoning codes for specified types of new buildings and major retrofits of existing buildings. And so all of the policies have to answer in different ways 3 main questions, which Chris has outlined and been a champion for helping many of these cities shape their answers to these. But it's first, what structures are covered by the policies? Second, how much and what percentage of these structures must be bird safe? And then third, how is bird safe defined? And how these questions are answered varies between the policies. And as you can imagine, how they're answered matters profoundly for how effective and rigorous the policies are as well. But across the board, I think these policies have been immensely popular, and we've seen lots of benefits from them. First being that when they're well designed, these policies can significantly reduce collisions at the regulated buildings. And second, these policies are helping to drive significantly increased demand for bird-friendly products, both in terms of spurring greater availability, but also market innovation. And so I think if you looked back in 2008, and Dan could speak to this better than me as an architect, but bird-friendly products were much less common and much less widely available. And now almost all of the major glass manufacturers and window film manufacturers are starting to offer bird-friendly products. And I think that is in no small part thanks to the legislation and the policy putting it so prominently on their radar.
That's right. In particular, the New York City law, Local Law 15 of 2020, changed the landscape dramatically because for New York City to have a bird-friendly building law meant that every manufacturer had to deal with it. All glass manufacturers want to be here, working on all the big buildings here, and they all had to adopt materials that they were not previously using or do research and development to bring new materials to market. And there's at least twice as many or more materials on the market now than there were before that law.
Absolutely, Dan. And I think it goes to that positive innovation we were just talking about. I think it's a big plus that different glass manufacturers have to comply. Builders get to have an assortment of options. They get to make aesthetic and creative decisions about their buildings to comply with bird safe building regulations. Chris, could you share any examples of some laws that might have been passed and any benefits or drawbacks they might have had?
The first real legislation was passed in San Francisco in 2011. It's not a great model, unfortunately, but it was first, and they deserve a great deal of praise for passing that legislation. It covers only facades of buildings within 300 feet of a park or water feature, which means that most of the city is not covered, unfortunately. But it has inspired many other communities in California to pass a similar and sometimes stricter legislation. I think that's really important because places in California like Richmond and Cupertino have looked at San Francisco and they've seen that they haven't had to spend money enforcing this, that they haven't built any ugly buildings, that really it's been business as usual, and therefore there's no reason not to protect birds. Dan talked about the legislation in New York City. A similar law is about to take effect in Washington, D.C., but there's also legislation in Illinois, in Wisconsin, in Maine, all over the country in lots of different places. People are getting inspired by existing legislation and saying, yes, we should do this here too. This is really critical because you can't do this one building at a time. There are just too many buildings.
Chris, through your work with the American Bird Conservancy, you've also worked closely with counties and municipalities to help them develop and pass bird-safe building legislation. Can you tell us more about the process of getting these drafted and passed and how to make legislation work for specific community needs?
There's a lot involved in passing legislation. We recommend that when people first think about doing this, they start by learning everything they can about the issue so they can answer questions easily and go out and start building a constituency. Give a talk to the local Boy Scouts. Talk to people in sustainability departments at universities. Find bird clubs. Get as many people in the area as you can interested in this issue. At the same time, it's important to look at legislation that's passed elsewhere. Take a look at what works, what maybe hasn't worked as well, so that when you're starting to try to develop your own legislation, you'll be able to come up with something that will work for your area and that will protect as many birds as possible. One of the things that we usually do is recommend talking to each person on the council or in the department that is going to be in charge of making decisions about whether this legislation will happen or not. It almost doesn't make sense to try to get legislation passed if you don't know that you've already got the votes for it.
It's wonderful that we have so many geographically diverse examples in the US, but birds aren't just migrating in North America. Are you seeing similar motivations to address the bird building collision issues in the international context?
So besides the US, there are some jurisdictions in Canada that have explicit bird collision mitigation laws or requirements, but otherwise internationally, there really aren't any. However, there are other international laws and efforts that are worth mentioning. I'm particularly excited about a new English law that requires a biodiversity net gain on new projects. So if you're building a new building in England, you have to have at least 10% net gain in biodiversity, which is wonderful, because the bird collision issue really is about reducing the problem. It's not exactly about regenerating, and both have to be paired. So if you're doing a new building and you're adding biodiversity, you really need to protect that biodiversity in the form of bird collision mitigation.
So, the legislation that has passed throughout the US in different areas, are there any limitations or just practical implications in the phrasing, in the limits of the legislation, anything like that?
In New York, there is a limit. Well, not just New York, all the legislation in the United States and I believe Canada is only about new construction. None of it to date deals with retrofits. However, there are efforts underway in New York and elsewhere to figure out how legislation around retrofits might work.
Yeah. And then in terms of other limitations, many of the local bird friendly building laws in the US share some of the same limitations. In many cases, these are some of the early mover cities that adopted these laws that really do deserve to be commended, but the laws could do with updating based on the science that's developed since then and a more rigorous understanding of what's needed to protect birds. So some of the limitations that sometimes occur are residential exemptions. And so this represents one of the biggest significant gaps in some of these policies. We know that birds are colliding with residences all the time, not just commercial buildings. But in some cities like San Francisco, effectively the residential districts, which encompass 70% roughly of the city, are excluded. So that means that the majority of buildings are not being regulated for this. There often are sometimes size exemptions as well. So Madison, Wisconsin's bird-friendly building law, for example, only applies to buildings that are over 10,000 square feet. But we know birds are hitting lots of buildings in large numbers that are smaller than that. Sometimes these laws are limited to bird-sensitive areas, quote unquote, which doesn't really make sense because we know that birds make diffuse use of all parts of the suburban and urban environment. So that's something that we would prefer not to see. And then in some cases, there can be unclear, maybe confusing definitions of what bird safe means. Chris's team at American Bird Conservancy developed this amazing material threat factor rating system, which rates materials on a scale of 1 to 100, and which is now being used in a lot of this legislation to define what a bird safe product is in a way that gives a lot of flexibility to architects and developers and designers while still being very rigorous. So I think that's really helped tremendously there. But ideally, we'd want to see that 100% of buildings are regulated, and that includes the first 100 feet, which is the area where birds are most active, being bird safe. And many of the standards don't quite reach that, though New York's example comes pretty close and is an inspiring one to look to as a model.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about New York in particular. You mentioned that one of the weaknesses is that residential buildings have some exemptions to bird-friendly legislation. And a lot of residences in New York are also in skyscrapers or in pretty tall buildings. So, do residential buildings in New York also have to comply with the bird-friendly buildings law?
Yes, the New York City law covers residences. Anything below 75 feet is covered.
And this is just amazing too when you think about it. Like, this is a city with 8 million people, roughly 1 million buildings, hundreds and hundreds of architecture firms, some of the world's most expensive real estate, extraordinary diversity in every way. And if this city can do a law that covers everything, I think really any city arguably can. So I think that is a tremendously inspiring example. And it's amazing that it includes all these residences and it's really popular.
That's a very powerful observation, Viveca, because a lot of times on this podcast, when we're talking about laws that work for every place, that's not always the case, right? A vast majority of the time, I would deign to say, what works for New York, the most populous city in the US, probably won't work for the average rural or suburban municipality in the rest of the US. But it's interesting, like you said, that New York is probably one of the most challenging places that you can carry out this legislation. So if you can do it in New York, it can be an inspiring example for other smaller cities and municipalities that are maybe less complex or just have their own complexities.
Yeah. And cities have taken different approaches. And certainly you're right that The New York City approach is not going to work in all cases. And I think Arlington, Virginia is a good example of another approach. And this is a county in Virginia that's undergone intensive development over the last 50 years. In Virginia, city governments can't require building standards stricter than the state standards without the authorization of the state legislature, but they can incentivize such standards. So Arlington in 2014 adopted first as a voluntary green building incentive program, a density bonus. So developers that wanted to build larger buildings could do so in exchange for meeting certain sustainability requirements. And then later on in 2020, I believe, going into effect in 2022, the city made this a requirement for the builders who wanted to get this density bonus. So there are other creative models that don't necessarily apply quite as widely, but do use the power that cities have to incentivize better practices for birds.
That's really interesting. We can incentivize, and there are also opportunities to disincentivize non-bird friendly regulations. Chris, maybe you can speak to this, but I'm sure with a lot of these bird collisions, it's not just common birds that are being harmed. There might be endangered or vulnerable species colliding with buildings and experiencing biodiversity loss as a result of the widespread collisions. In many countries and jurisdictions, if you do something to harm an endangered species or a vulnerable species, there can be fines or other legal consequences for those actions. So, do buildings that are not bird safe face similar consequences? Let's presume that an individual from a heavily endangered species was killed as a result of a bird collision. Is there any mechanism in place to hold the buildings or the folks who built that building or somebody responsible for that animal's death?
The Migratory Bird Treaty Act would seem to cover such situations. The Fish and Wildlife Service has been looking into how you would enforce this because it would be so broadly applicable that it would be very difficult to figure out. But if a Kirtland's warbler dies on a garage door in Michigan somewhere, nobody will know about it most of the time. So there has not been a system of enforcement that has been figured out at this point.
Dan, from that industry perspective, what are some challenges that these laws present to architecture and construction firms? Viveca hinted at some hidden opportunities and incentives as well. So could you touch on those too?
Yeah, there are a number of challenges. The first being human perception. People want to be connected with nature, and people love nature. People want to look out the window and see it. And it's so ironic that that act can kill birds. So, we have to convince people that it's going to be okay when we design a building that has patterns on the glass, that it's in fact helping the nature that they want to see, even though it may be making it harder for them to see it. So we're constantly balancing those priorities to connect people with nature through clear glass and to protect the birds at the same time. Another challenge is cost. All of the bird collision mitigation solutions cost something, and sometimes they can cost more or less depending on the situation. The glass, even though it doesn't look like much, it's very complicated and there are many parameters, so it can get costly fast. And we've had various building owners come down on different sides. Some prioritize the view and get the most expensive stuff, and some prioritize the cost and get very visible stuff. And, we're all anxiously awaiting word of how these buildings are doing that have been subject to that law. There are some opportunities in bird collision mitigation techniques that, if designed in early enough, have co-benefits. So, for example, the pattern on the glass that is dense enough, or solar shading device patterns that are dense enough, can reduce the heat load in buildings and reduce the energy use and air conditioning costs and emissions. So that's a win-win. Another one is privacy. We have one building where there's a privacy issue, and the addition of bird-friendly measures on that glass had a twofer in that situation as well. Additionally, some people really hate the glare that comes off of buildings. There was this famous example in England of the walkie-talkie building like melting a van because the sun was being focused, and people driving down expressways being blinded by the light off of buildings. Bird-friendly mitigation measures can reduce the glare that come off of buildings. In other words, being a more respectful neighbor. So there are a number of co-benefits that, if thought about early enough, can be synergistic.
Chris, outside of the direct bird safe legislation that has been passed, are there any other urban planning policies that might touch on this issue too? Anything co-beneficial? For example, I'm based in Washington, D.C., and we have height density restrictions here in our buildings. So our buildings have maximum heights. And I'm curious what kind of impacts these urban planning policies have.
I think, unfortunately, DC's height restrictions don't help much because it is that first 100 feet that is most critical. That's where most collisions take place. So, not that there aren't collisions at high levels of very tall buildings, but the majority of collisions on tall buildings take place on the lower floors. New York City has started requiring green roofs, and this is something that we're seeing in other places too. And green roofs have been around long enough that we know they do provide some resources for birds. They can provide food, stopover habitat, shelter, in some cases, even nesting sites. So there are requirements like that. Requirements for park areas, for example, which is also habitat for birds, can reduce heat island effects and provide other good things that all make the local environment better for birds. And as long as the glass is safe, what you want is a bird-friendly habitat around your buildings.
Yeah, the phenomenon of green roofs is an important one in this conversation because as more and more green roofs are getting added to buildings that are above 75 or 100 feet. So in New York, for example, I'm looking out at a green roof with trees across out the window that I see, and I'm sitting at about, I don't know, 125 feet off the ground. So there's this whole other upper layer of urban ecosystem that's being built out and which we need more of. So the issue of at what height collisions occur is one that perhaps should be revisited at some point in the future. And it is a benefit of height limits like in DC.
This might be a bit of a sidebar, but I've noticed that birds often land on boats and ships to rest during long flights. Is bird collision an issue for non-land structures off the coast, like cargo ships or oil rigs or any other kind of industrial platform? Are there any regulations around that?
We're really just starting to look at that, but there are many examples of lighting on ships at night attracting large numbers of birds and causing mortality. The same thing happens with lighting on drilling platforms and wind turbines that are out at sea. So, I mean, it's a big issue, but there are no regulations for sure at this point.
Dan, I know you mentioned green roofs, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't necessarily have to be an architect to create a green natural space on your private property. And I'm wondering if there are any other opportunities for meaningful public involvement. Is it as simple as maybe put some plants on your roof to help attract birds, get involved locally with bird safe building initiatives, or even just get a chalk marker and draw on your window pane?
Public involvement can be very important to the bird collision issue. The volunteers in New York City at Project Safe Flight, which is a program of the New York City Bird Alliance, have been very instrumental in documenting bird collisions around the city and identifying problem buildings. And other people, even on social media, posting about collisions here and there, have actually gotten the attention of legislators and other people. I would say that all of that stuff definitely contributed to legislators taking notice of the issue and being attuned to the importance of it, and ultimately the law here being passed.
Yeah, I'd say too that in the studies that we've done of cities that have passed these laws, and not all cases have carcass monitoring data been presented, but in many they have, and it's extremely compelling. So I think it takes resources to launch a campaign to get such policies passed, and it takes a lot of resources to fix buildings that are already built and they're problematic too. So I think having that proof, particularly when it's so visceral and moving to see these photos and to hear testimonies firsthand from people who collect the birds and have witnessed the collisions, is quite impactful when it comes to passing these policies.
This is an issue, though, where people, compared to most conservation issues, this is something where almost anybody can do something almost immediately. As long as they have access to their own windows, there are millions of things to do. And you're right, maybe not chalk markers, but something as simple and cheap as tempera paint will work very well. And there are many more sophisticated solutions that people can implement too. But it is something that you can do something about yourself.
That's really wonderful to hear. It seems like there's definitely accessible ways for the public to get involved through volunteering or taking private action or just publicly supporting legislation being passed in their community. Going into a specific example about the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center, Dan, could you tell us more about the renovation of this convention center as an architect? And just take us through the process.
Yeah, the Javits Center was identified by the New York City Bird Alliance as the worst bird killer in the city back in the early 2000s. And we got involved because the building needed a full retrofit. Its glass had deteriorated over, 50 years or however long it was in place. And it just needed to be replaced. And simultaneous with that replacement, the Javits Center wanted to achieve some other things like energy reduction and opening what was previously a kind of closed feeling building to the city. The glass was very darkly tinted, and that gave it kind of a mirror effect from the outside and kind of a sunglass effect on the inside. So you couldn't really see in and out of it. They very much wanted to be able to kind of show the life that was going on inside the building. The Javits Center also has glass on its facade and on its roof. So the building is like a big greenhouse. And we knew that the solar heat gain from the sun was going to be a major driver in the decision making on the glass. So we consciously chose a way to deal with that using ceramic frit, very small dots on the glass that help reflect solar heat gain, which we knew would also be a bird-friendly measure. There are also some parts of the building where there was glass that just had solid wall behind it and was just there for aesthetic purposes and not really for visual purposes. And for that glass, which was particularly reflective, we replaced with stainless steel panels. While doing all of that, we added a 7-acre green roof on top of the building. So while adding habitat, particularly habitat that has been attractive to birds, my understanding is that something like 50 species have been spotted on the green roof, including nesting gulls who live there. It was that much more important to make the glass bird friendly. And we successfully reduced the collisions there by over 90%.
90% is an enormous reduction. How was the center identified as the top bird killer in the city? How did they measure its success after the renovation?
The monitoring was organized by the New York City Bird Alliance, and their Project Safe Flight members regularly visited the building during migration season. And it's kind of a citizen science project run by them, and they counted the collisions and reported the numbers.
Viveca, your 2023 co-authored report titled Building Safer Cities for Birds offers case studies into a couple of municipalities that have implemented bird-safe policies. We've discussed some of these different pieces of legislation, but were there any further insights you gained from doing case studies across so many geographically diverse areas in the U.S.?
Yeah, there were a number of takeaways. I think the first one, which is probably obvious already from this conversation, is that cities have really paved the way and shown that bird-friendly building policies can be affordable, they can be effective, and they can be very popular. Another takeaway is that some of these policies are much more effective and rigorous than others, and how the policy is crafted matters. So some have a lot of exemptions or only apply to a small number of buildings, while others, like New York's, are quite comprehensive and offer very strong models. So cities that are looking to pass policies as models to adopt should take that into account and focus on the ones that provide the most sort of science-based rigor. I'd say it also really highlights that we need creative new policy strategies to try to address existing building stock. The US has something like 240 billion square feet of residential buildings and nearly 100 billion square feet of commercial buildings. And the vast majority of those buildings standing today are still going to be standing in 2050. And for the impact of birds of those buildings, if they're not retrofitted, is quite profound. So figuring out policy solutions that can incentivize and support transitioning existing buildings to become bird friendly is very much needed and important. And then lastly, I would say that local action complements and has inspired, but it doesn't replace the need for state or federal action on this issue. 75% of birds in North America migrate. Most migratory birds twice a year are traveling through hundreds of jurisdictions across the country. So enacting the policies that we studied in this report all required an enormous amount of effort and championing and a sustained multi-year efforts by advocates and architects and scientists, a level of effort that I think would be hard to replicate in thousands and thousands of cities and towns nationwide. So we need states to step up and to protect birds as well. And in some cases, as these laws proliferate in California, for example, it may be easier to address this at the state level as opposed to in differing laws at different cities at the city level. So you have one consistent, hopefully rigorous law at the state level instead of a patchwork of various city policies.
How do these laws and how does this problem fit into the broader need to integrate urban wild animal welfare into public policy?
Bird collisions with glass is possibly one of the most visible conservation crises out there. I mean, virtually everyone has heard or seen a bird hit glass. There are many, many, many other issues that are not so visible that people are not going to be as aware of, whether it's bats, which also collide with buildings, birds losing nesting habitat, birds losing all kinds of habitat when construction takes place without thought, without replacing the resources that they take away. So I think that the glass collision issue is something that can really lead the way to other kinds of legislation to address this crisis in biodiversity.
Absolutely. Their visibility really impacts actions taken on them more than one might think. It's definitely a topic that has come up in previous episodes, like in our pollinator episode. Even though the collision issue is really widespread, birds are also quite cute, and there are a lot of different types, and people seem to like them, which can be advantageous for them. But then for something like a bat, which is also experiencing collisions, they also don't have the best reputation, and people are scared of them. It can be harder to garner that collective action, like Viveca said.
I mean, even insects are impacted to the point where species that eat them are impacted. So everything is connected, basically, and we have to be careful about what we do.
Absolutely, right? That's the beauty and the danger of the food web, that these impacts do trickle down. And what are some future developments to watch? What's next on the horizon for this issue?
Well, we keep hearing about new technology that's being developed. Manufacturers are coming up with different ways of putting patterns on glass using lasers, using different materials, being able to put these patterns on the outside surface of the glass, whereas they used to only be able to put them on the inside surface, different ways of applying the UV reflective patterns that make it easier to incorporate into buildings. So it's pretty exciting to see a lot of R&D going on. And then otherwise, I really have some optimism around this idea of regenerative design. We're not really thinking about it that way, but it's a nascent trend in the industry. Another trend is retrofits. We've definitely heard about a lot more retrofits in the last few years than there were previously, and also on bigger buildings. We know about a few sports arenas, for example, or other convention centers where that kind of thing is happening. And many universities are looking at this, as well as other kinds of building owners.
Well, I think one trend that we're seeing that Chris mentioned is more and more cities and states, in some cases, are starting to adopt these policies. And that's, I think, tremendously exciting. And the more the merrier, and we need them all to do that. And so I think that migrating birds and people just cannot coexist in the way that we need them to unless there is substantial policy action on this issue, as well as many others. So that's a trend that's heartening, but not happening at the speed that we need it to. So I think anything that can be done to support cities and localities and beyond who are trying to address this issue is very worthwhile and hopeful.
Well, thank you so much for ending us on that positive note, Viveca. I think that with collective action and awareness raising, we really can make a difference in this issue and make our areas more compatible with birds' needs. Thank you all for joining me, and this has been People, Places, Planet.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.